I stood in front of the project in Dallas that should have carried my name. The large sign hanging on the steel frame reflected the harsh Texas sunlight, and the bold words, Monroe Development Group, made my eyes ache. I let him win. The first time. No one knew that sentence only echoed inside my head, not because I was weak, but because I understood that some battles should not be won with noise. Dallas was booming after the pandemic. Uptown was expanding, investment funds from New York were flowing in, and everyone was hunting for prime land. I had pursued the shopping center project in Austin for 8 months. I flew back and forth between Dallas and Austin almost every week, sitting in cold meeting rooms with blueprints stretched across glass tables. I believed I had secured the deal. The numbers worked, the zoning was legal, the construction team was ready. My name is Nash Carter, 32 years old. I grew up in a Houston suburb in a middle-class family that believed in the value of labor. I built Carter Development from small projects, 20-unit apartments, then 50 units. I believed in fair competition. I believed that if I did better, I would win. Blake Monroe did not believe that. He was 10 years older than me, from a family with political connections in Texas. He had a way of entering a meeting room as if everything already belonged to him. When we competed for the Austin project, I knew he was formidable. But I still believed data would speak for me. Then one evening, the lead investor called me. His voice hesitated. Nash, we've decided to shift direction. Shift direction. A gentle word for betrayal. They signed with Monroe Development. No satisfactory explanation, just a better strategic fit. I sat alone in my office, looking down at Interstate I-35. I knew something was wrong. Rumors spread faster than I expected. Blake had private meetings with the city council, dinners not listed on public schedules. I had no proof, but I understood the rules of the game had changed. On the announcement day, I still went. Not because I hoped for a miracle, but because I needed to see my failure clearly. Blake stepped onto the stage, lights reflecting off his perfect navy suit. He spoke about the future vision of Austin, not once mentioning the competitive bid, not once mentioning the name Nash Carter. I stood among the crowd, hearing the applause rise like a wall. In that moment, I could have stepped out, called my lawyer, turned this into a 2-year lawsuit. But I understood that if I did, I would only be trying to reclaim what I had lost. I would be dragged into the same mud I despised. My lawyer suggested suing for unfair competition. A friend in media said I could leak certain details to pressure public opinion. I listened to all of it. I thanked them. Then I refused. That night, I drove past the construction site under development. Dust rose under yellow lights. I stopped for a few minutes, looking at the steel frame rising. I did not see Blake in it. I saw my lesson. I whispered inside the car. I let him win. The first time. I did not know then that this decision to stay silent would cost me almost everything. But I knew one thing for certain. If I rebuilt, I would not build a project. I would build an empire. 2 weeks after the announcement in Austin, my company's bank account was almost at the bottom. I had never stared at the numbers on the banking screen for that long. They were no longer cash flow. No longer growth charts. They were the heartbeat of my company, and it was weakening. I understood that failure does not end when the stage lights turn off. It begins at that moment. I left Dallas in silence. No press conference, no statement. I drove back to Houston, where I grew up, where no one cared that I had just lost a $100 million project. This city was more practical. Here, people did not applaud you for speeches. They asked whether you could pay on time. The Houston office of Carter Development was much smaller than the Dallas headquarters. An old floor, slightly scratched glass doors, a meeting table that seated 6 people. I stood in the room looking at my team. 12 people left. 3 had resigned in the first week after the failure. I did not blame them. I could not. My name is Nash Carter, and for the first time, I felt that name heavier than usual. Emma Hayes walked into the meeting room with her laptop. She was my CFO, the only person who never asked why we lost the Austin project. She only asked, How long do we have? The question had no emotion, no judgment, just mathematics. 3 months without new contracts, she said, projecting the cash flow forecast onto the screen. 6 months if you cut all marketing costs and delay the San Antonio project. 3 months. I nodded. I did not panic. That surprised Emma more than if I had been angry. The problem was not just money. Rumors about me had begun spreading in Texas investment circles. That I was not big enough yet. That I could not secure deals. A small Dallas fund withdrew its commitment for a new Houston project. The bank emailed requesting a credit line review. Every call began the same way. Nash, we need to discuss further. I sat in my office looking at the parking lot. No more big city lights. No more glass skyscrapers. Just concrete and hot wind. I could sue Blake. I could tell my story in the press. But I understood that if I did that now, I would only confirm to the market that I was a failed man trying to justify himself. I called an internal meeting. I told the remaining team that we would restructure, cut costs, focus on smaller projects with higher margins, no longer chasing scale to prove anything. We would pursue sustainability. Some looked at me with doubt. Some looked as if waiting for the final decision to leave. I made no promises. I only said, whoever stays, we rebuild from the foundation. The following week, I sold my Dallas penthouse. It had been my first symbol of success. I once stood on its balcony looking at the city and thought I had reached the peak. Now I signed the sale papers to maintain company liquidity. While moving out, I realized my feeling was not loss. It was lightness. Nothing left to prove. No glamorous image to maintain. Emma and I began reanalyzing the entire strategy. We realized one thing. I had been too focused on rapid growth. I wanted to prove I was equal to the big corporations. I wanted to beat Blake on the same field. And that was the mistake. We shifted toward developing a smaller mixed-use complex in Houston, a lower-risk project but optimized for cash flow. I personally joined every lease negotiation. I reviewed every legal clause instead of delegating everything to lawyers. During those days, I worked 16 hours a day, not because I feared bankruptcy, but because I began to understand more clearly what I was building. Not reputation, not recognition, but foundation. 3 months passed. 2 more employees left, but those who remained began trusting me more when they saw numbers stabilizing. The Houston project secured pre-leases for 60% of the space during construction. One evening, Emma looked at me and said, "You're different now." I asked, "Different how?" "You don't want to beat others anymore. You just don't want to lose to yourself." I did not answer immediately. I knew she was right. The failure in Austin took my project, but it also took my impatience. And as I stood alone in the Houston office, watching the balance sheet slowly turn green again, I understood that my silence was not weakness. It was the quiet before I built something bigger. The email arrived on a Monday morning while I was reviewing a lease agreement for the Houston project. The subject line was short. Inquiry, Sustainable Urban Development Proposal. The sender, Daniel Whitmore, managing partner of an investment fund in New York. I read it 3 times to make sure I was not mistaken. 2 years earlier, I had sent a proposal to this fund and received no reply. I do not believe in luck. I believe in timing. And I understood this email was not an opportunity. It was a test. New York was completely different from Texas. When I stepped out of JFK Airport, the air felt colder and heavier. The skyscrapers did not need to impress anyone. They had been there long before you arrived. I went straight to the fund's office in Midtown Manhattan, carrying a presentation revised for 3 weeks. My name is Nash Carter, and I was no longer the man standing beneath the stage in Austin. The meeting room had glass walls overlooking a busy avenue. Daniel Whitmore entered calmly. He did not shake hands for long. He did not smile politely. He opened my file and said, "You lost a major project in Texas." I nodded. "Yes." "Why should we trust you this time?" The question did not irritate me. It sharpened me. I did not talk about Blake. I did not mention politics. I opened the first slide, the Urban Sustainable Mixed-Use Complex Development Model. I spoke about Houston's population density, long-term leasing trends, LEED Platinum standards, and the ability to achieve stable returns over 10 years. Daniel did not interrupt. He only took notes. I realized I was no longer trying to impress. I was explaining. I was proving with data. Every number I presented had a source. Every forecast had a contingency plan. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When I finished, Daniel asked one final question. What if you fail again? I looked straight at him. I will not fail twice for the same reason. The room was silent for a few seconds. I added nothing. No extra persuasion. I had learned that speaking more does not make decisions easier. 3 days later, I received a call. The fund agreed to pilot invest in a Houston project, with strict cash flow control and quarterly reporting conditions. Not a massive investment, but enough to elevate my company to another level. When I returned to Houston, I did not announce it loudly. I called Emma into the room and said, "We have a new partner." She looked at me for a few seconds and smiled. "You convinced them?" I did not convince. I proved. The new project began faster than I expected. With backing from the New York fund, the Houston bank reopened our credit line. Contractors who had hesitated returned to the negotiating table. The market reacted positively when the fund's name appeared in the press release. But the biggest change was not money. I changed how I operated. Every major decision was analyzed under 3 risk scenarios. I required weekly progress reports instead of monthly ones. I learned to say no to opportunities that sounded glamorous but lacked solid foundations. Some nights I stayed in the office until 1 a.m., looking at the mixed-use complex blueprint stretched across the table. I no longer saw it as a building. I saw it as a statement. I did not collapse. Once Daniel flew down to Houston to inspect progress. He walked along the construction site, asking each engineer about timelines and costs. When the visit ended, he said to me, "You've changed." "I had to change," I replied. "No," he shook his head. "You chose to change." I thought about that sentence for many days. The Houston project finished on schedule and exceeded profit forecasts by 8% in the first year. Not a number that shocked the market. But it was stable. It was proof. When I stood on the rooftop of the completed building, looking down at the city, I did not think about Blake. I thought about Austin. About the failure that forced me to examine myself. I understood that rebirth is not building the same thing bigger. Rebirth is building again with a different mindset. And when I signed the contract for the next project, a riverfront site in Chicago, I knew the game had changed. This time I was not chasing opportunity. Opportunity was coming to me. 2 years after the day I stood beneath the stage in Austin, I no longer had to look for projects. Projects came to me. When the file for the Chicago riverfront site landed on my desk, I knew this was not just a business opportunity. It was a closed loop. The land sat near the Chicago River, strategically positioned between the financial district and high-end residential areas. The city wanted to develop a mixed-use complex, including offices, apartments, and commercial space, meeting the highest sustainability standards. Larger in scale than the project I had once lost in Austin. I looked at the master plan and realized, if we won the bid, Carter Development would step into an entirely different level. My name is Nash Carter, and this time, I was not building to prove anything. The bid invitation was public. Major corporations from New York, Chicago, and Texas participated. In the competitor list, I saw a familiar name, Monroe Development Group. Blake Monroe was still there, still ambitious, still appearing wherever value was highest. I did not feel anger when I saw his name. I felt clarity. Chicago in early autumn carried a different coldness than Texas. I flew here many times during the preparation process. Each time I walked along the riverbank, I asked myself, what if I lose this time? The answer no longer frightened me. I knew I had a stronger foundation than 2 years ago. Emma handled the entire financial structure of the project. Daniel Whitmore joined as strategic investor. We spent weeks building a 10-year profit model, occupancy forecasts, market risk analysis, and cash flow protection plans in case of economic downturn. I required the design team to aim for LEED Platinum from the beginning, not for media attention, but because I believed sustainability was the future of American urban development. In a pre-evaluation meeting, I saw Blake sitting at the opposite end of the table. He still wore the perfect suit like the day in Austin. When our eyes met, he gave a slight nod. No smile, no greeting. This time the conflict was not public. No obvious rumors. But I knew Blake would not ignore this opportunity. A few weeks later, several articles began questioning the rapid expansion capability of Carter Development. No negative evidence, only doubts. Emma asked whether we should respond. I shook my head. We do not argue with articles. We argue with documentation. The presentation day before the Chicago City Council came faster than I expected. The meeting hall was large, high ceiling, cold white lights. I stepped to the podium feeling different from 2 years ago. Not pressure, focus. I did not speak about competitors. I did not mention the past. I presented the project as if it already existed. A community-connected complex, green riverfront spaces, local job opportunities, stable revenue for the city over a decade. After the presentation, a council member asked, "What makes you different from other developers?" I answered, "I build with a long-term vision, not to win a single round." When I left the room, I did not know the result. Blake stepped out a few minutes after me. He said briefly, "Good luck." I looked at him and said, "Thank you." 3 weeks of waiting were the longest 3 weeks in the past 2 years. I did not allow myself to be dragged into speculation. I focused on current projects. I maintained normal working rhythm, but every time my phone vibrated, I still felt my heart pause for a beat. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. The Chicago City representative informed the decision. Carter Development was selected as the official developer for the Riverfront project. I did not jump. I did not shout. I just sat still for a few seconds. 2 years ago, I lost a project because I was not strong enough. Today, I won a project because I had changed. I called Emma first. She did not say much, just exhaled deeply. I called Daniel. He said, "Now it truly begins." The press conference announcing the result took place a week later. When the name Carter Development was announced, I heard applause echo through the hall. This time, I was not standing below. I stood on stage. In the guest rows, I saw Blake. He was not in the front row, not speaking, no longer the center. After the ceremony, he approached me. "You've come far," he said. I replied, "I just didn't stop." When I stepped outside the Chicago City Council building, wind from the river blew across my shoulders. I looked toward the riverfront site, where in a few months it would become a massive construction ground. I understood that this victory was not revenge. It was proof that I was no longer someone chasing opportunity with impatience. I did not reclaim the project I lost. I built something bigger. 1 week before the groundbreaking ceremony in Chicago, I received an anonymous link to an article sent to the company email. The headline was short but sharp. Nash Carter, rapid growth or bubble about to burst. I read each line slowly. No specific accusations, no evidence of wrongdoing, just questions placed precisely enough to plant doubt. I was used to doubt, but this time, it was not only aimed at my personal reputation. It targeted the Riverfront project, the largest project of my career. Chicago was watching, investors were watching, and Blake Monroe was certainly watching too. Carter Development's temporary office in Chicago overlooked the construction site preparing for development. Cranes were not yet raised, but material trucks had begun arriving. I stood by the glass window, the article still open on my phone. No author signature. But I understood this tactic. Ask enough questions, and the market will create its own answers. Emma walked in with a more serious expression than usual. "The bank called," she said. "They want to update the cash flow model before releasing the next disbursement." I was not surprised. Because of the article? Possibly. I sat down and opened my laptop. I knew that if rumors spread without proper handling, they could delay the disbursement schedule. and just a small delay could affect the entire construction chain. Blake did not appear. He did not need to. In business, indirect attacks are often more effective than direct confrontation. The meeting with the bank took place the next morning. Glass meeting room, white lighting, tense but polite atmosphere. The bank representative said, "We just want to ensure Carter Development's expansion pace is sustainable." I did not respond defensively. I opened the 10-year forecast table, presenting again each risk scenario we had built with the New York Fund. I emphasized the 70% pre-leased commercial space. I provided an additional guarantee commitment from the fund in case of market volatility. I did not mention the article. I did not blame anyone. I only presented data. When the meeting ended, the bank representative said, "We will proceed with the planned disbursement schedule." I nodded, no smile. That afternoon, Emma asked whether we should hold a press conference to respond. I thought for a few minutes. If I reacted too strongly, I would turn suspicion into a major event. If I remained completely silent, rumors might continue to smolder. I chose another way. I proactively invited several reputable financial journalists to visit the construction site, not to answer accusations, but to let them see real progress. I provided public financial documents. I answered each question with specific numbers. One journalist asked directly, "Are you in personal competition with Blake Monroe?" I looked straight into the camera and answered, "I do not build for personal competition. I build to outlast market cycles." That answer appeared on the front page of a Chicago financial newspaper 2 days later. Not sensational, not dramatic, but enough to reshape the narrative. Over the next 3 days, the market stabilized. Tenants continued signing leases on schedule. No one withdrew commitments. I knew Blake was waiting for me to react incorrectly, waiting for me to lose my temper, waiting for me to counterattack. But I was no longer at that stage. That evening, I stood alone on the riverfront site. The wind was colder than Texas. I remembered Austin. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I would face a subtle media campaign and remain calm, I would not have believed it. The difference was not in Blake's tactics. It was in my foundation. Media can create doubt, but it cannot create cash flow if the project is not real. It cannot create lease contracts if clients do not trust. 1 week later, the groundbreaking ceremony proceeded as planned. I stood at the podium, behind me a massive design board of the riverfront complex. I did not mention the article. I did not mention rumors. I spoke about jobs, long-term growth, commitment to the city of Chicago. In the guest rows, I saw Blake. He sat silently, expressionless, no longer controlling the narrative. When I finished speaking, applause echoed steadily. Not wild noise, but stable recognition. I understood that media can be a battlefield. But true victory is not in extinguishing rumors. It is in not letting rumors redirect you. I did not answer Blake with words. I answered with construction progress. And for the first time since Austin, I knew one thing for certain. He no longer controlled my rhythm. 3 months before the completion of Phase 1 of the Chicago Riverfront project, I received a call that was not on the schedule. The number displayed was from the primary financing bank. I answered immediately while standing in the middle of the construction site, drilling sounds and metal clashing behind me. The bank representative's voice was lower and slower than usual. "Nash, we need to conduct an additional review of the loan. There are some internal concerns." I did not ask why. I simply said, "When?" "Tomorrow." I ended the call and stood still for a few seconds amid dust and cold river wind. I knew this was not a routine procedure. The loan had been approved and dispersed on schedule for months. An additional review near completion meant someone had triggered something. I did not need evidence to guess. Blake did not disappear from the game just because he was silent. The temporary Chicago office lights stayed on all night. Emma sat across from me, her screen filled with dense numerical tables. Daniel Whitmore joined the meeting via video from New York. "They may be under pressure," Daniel said. "If someone internally questions risk, they could temporarily halt disbursement." "We have no violations," Emma said firmly. "I know," I replied. But risk does not only come from violations, it comes from doubt. If the bank paused disbursement, the main contractor could suspend work. The supply chain would be disrupted, and one delay announcement would immediately raise market questions. The next morning, I walked into the bank meeting room with a completely different mindset than 2 years ago. Not angry, not defensive, just focused. The credit committee consisted of 5 members. One of them looked at me longer than usual. I guessed he was the one who raised the internal concern. "Mr. Carter," one member began, "there are opinions suggesting your project deployment speed is too fast compared to your company size 2 years ago." I nodded. Yes, 2 years ago we were smaller. I did not deny the past. I opened the independent audit report, presented actual cash flow, signed lease contracts, occupancy rates, and additional capital guarantee commitments from the New York Investment Fund. I looked at each committee member while speaking. Not rushing, not justifying. "The question is not how fast we have grown," I said, "but whether we have sufficient foundation to sustain growth. And the data shows we do." The room fell silent. I could sense they were weighing not only numbers, but my attitude. One member asked, "What if the commercial real estate market declines next year?" I answered, "We have locked in 72% of commercial space with long-term contracts. The remaining portion is protected within our risk model. If a downturn occurs, we still maintain positive cash flow." I did not know what Blake had done behind the scenes, but I knew he hoped I would react like 2 years ago, impatient, emotional, trying to prove myself right with words. The meeting lasted longer than expected. When I left the room, I did not receive an immediate answer. They said they would notify me within 24 hours. Those 24 hours were the longest since the project began. I still went to the site, still met engineers, still approved interior designs. But in my mind was one single question. If they stop, do I have a plan B? The following afternoon, my phone vibrated. The bank representative informed the decision. Continue disbursement as planned. No change in terms. I said nothing for a few seconds. Then I replied, "Thank you." I placed the phone down and looked out the window. The construction site was as noisy as usual. None of the hundreds of workers knew that just hours earlier, their project could have been frozen. Emma entered the room. I simply nodded. She understood. That evening, Daniel called me. "You passed the test," he said. "What test?" "Not the bank's, yours." I thought about that sentence while driving along the Chicago riverfront. 2 years ago, I lost a project because I lacked the foundation to withstand pressure. Today, I kept the project not because I was stronger than Blake, but because I was stronger than my former self. Blake did not call me, did not text. His silence this time was different. Not the silence of someone waiting for opportunity, but the silence of someone realizing old tactics no longer worked. I understood more clearly than ever. The strongest counterattack is not attack. It is the ability to stand firm when others try to shake you. The project continued moving forward. Cranes rose higher each week. Steel frames reflected the afternoon sunlight on the river surface. I stood in the middle of the site and realized I was no longer building to prove anything to Blake. I was building because I chose this path, and I had the resilience to walk it to the end. And this time, no one could push me back to the starting line. The inauguration day of Phase 1 of the Chicago Riverfront Complex arrived sooner than I expected. 2 years ago, I stood beneath the stage watching someone else take the spotlight. Today, I stood backstage, waiting for the host to announce my name. I heard background music echoing outside the hall, people talking, cameras testing flash. I no longer felt the nervousness I once did. I only felt clarity. Chicago that morning was clear and cold. Wind from the river brushed across the glass facade of the newly completed building, reflecting a pale blue sky. Hundreds of guests were present, city representatives, investors from New York, leasing partners, engineers, and financial media. I looked through the stage curtain gap and realized this was not just a ceremony. It was a milestone. My name is Nash Carter, and today I was no longer standing in anyone's shadow. The host began speaking about Carter Development's journey over the past 2 years. I heard the numbers repeated: occupancy rate, jobs created, projected city revenue. But in my mind were different images. The small meeting room in Houston, the bank phone call, the night I sold my Dallas penthouse. "Please welcome Mr. Nash Carter," the host's voice echoed. I stepped onto the stage. The lights shone directly into my eyes, but I did not blink. I paused for a few seconds before the podium, looking down at the audience, and then I saw him. Blake Monroe sat in the third row, not the front. Dark gray suit, calm expression as always. No longer the one standing on stage like in Austin. No longer the center of the story. At that moment, the conflict was no longer about competing for a project. It was about the meaning of this journey. I could have said something alluding to the past. I could have revived the Austin story to create media drama. But I understood it was no longer necessary. I began my speech with a simple sentence. 2 years ago, I lost a project. The hall fell silent. I did not mention Blake's name. I did not talk about politics. I only spoke about the lesson, about how building is not only concrete and steel, but discipline and long-term vision. I spoke about Chicago as a city that believes in sustainability. I spoke about creating space for community, not just profit for shareholders. I spoke about growth, not to defeat someone else, but to outlast market cycles. When I ended with the sentence, "We do not build for today. We build for the next 10 years." Applause echoed steadily and prolonged. The climax was not in the applause, it was inside me. I did not look at Blake to see his reaction. I did not need to. After the speech, I was invited to cut the inauguration ribbon with city representatives. The red ribbon stretched between 2 shining steel columns. When it was cut, I did not think about victory. I thought about persistence. The ceremony continued with interviews. A journalist asked me, "Do you consider this a comeback after failure?" I answered, "I do not consider it a comeback. I consider it continuation." That answer was not loud, but I knew it was enough. When the formalities ended, guests began touring the interior of the complex. I walked slowly along the glass corridor overlooking the river. Outside, the first residents had stopped to take photos. The project was no longer a blueprint. It had become part of the city. Blake approached me as the crowd thinned. "You did it," he said, voice neither sarcastic nor challenging. "I only did what I had to do," I replied. He looked at the building for a few seconds and said, "The market won't be easy." "I know," I answered, "but I'm no longer building for the short-term market." We stood side by side in silence for a few seconds. No hatred, no friendliness. Just 2 men understanding that the game had changed. When Blake walked away, I did not look back. I stepped onto the 3rd-floor balcony overlooking the winding Chicago River. The wind was stronger than in the morning. I placed my hand on the cold metal railing. I remembered my words 2 years ago. I let him win. The first time. Today, I did not need to say anything more. I did not reclaim the project I lost. I did not destroy my rival. I did not need to prove myself right. I simply stood there, watching the building reflect the sunset, and understood that the greatest victory is not surpassing others. It is surpassing yourself. The ceremony ended as the sun leaned toward the west. Guests gradually left the complex. Interior lights began reflecting on the Chicago River like endless lines of light. I stayed behind, walking slowly through each floor of the building, as if wanting to memorize every detail of this moment. 2 years ago, I left Austin in silence. Today, I stood in the middle of a completed project, without needing to say much. The loop had closed. I stepped into the glass corridor overlooking the river. Chicago at night carried a different calm than during the day. No applause, no flashlights, only wind and steady flowing water. I heard footsteps behind me. Blake Monroe stopped a few meters away. No journalists, no partners. Just the 2 of us and the quiet space between river and glass. "How long have you waited for this day?" he asked. The question did not carry challenge. It sounded like genuine curiosity. I did not turn immediately. I looked at the river for a few more seconds before answering. I did not wait for this day. I just did not stop. Blake stepped closer, standing beside me. We looked in the same direction. He said, "2 years ago, I thought you would sue, or turn it into a battle." "I thought so too," I replied. "Why didn't you?" I turned to look at him for the first time during the conversation. "Because if I had won that way, I would forever be chasing you." He fell silent. I continued, "I did not reclaim the project you took. I built something bigger." Wind from the river blew stronger, moving our suit jackets slightly. Blake looked down at the water, then said slowly, "You've changed." I had to change. He shook his head lightly, just as Daniel once did. "No, you chose to change." That sentence did not make me reflect as long as before. I knew it was true. We stood there a few more minutes. No hatred, no handshake symbolizing reconciliation, just an unspoken acknowledgement that the game between us was no longer the same. "Good luck with the next rounds," Blake said before leaving. "I don't think in rounds anymore," I replied. When he disappeared down the corridor, I remained there, hand resting on the glass railing. I did not feel victory in the usual sense. I did not feel that I had defeated anyone. I only felt that I had matured enough to no longer need to defeat anyone. I left the building as security prepared to close. The city at night opened before me, lights reflecting on damp streets. I remembered the small room in Houston, the red numbers on the balance sheet, the night I wondered whether I should quit. If that day I had chosen to sue Blake, I might have spent 2 years in courtrooms. I might have preserved a little pride but lost focus. I might have won a lawsuit but never built this project. I understood that success is not immediate reaction to injustice. Success is the ability to patiently build a foundation stronger than that injustice. I stopped by the roadside, looking up at the building one last time. The Carter Development Group logo shone clearly against the dark sky. It did not only represent a project, it represented the decision I made 2 years ago, the decision to remain silent. I let him win. The first time, I whispered once more. But I did not say it with bitterness. I said it with gratitude. Because if he had not won that time, I might never have forced myself to change. I might have continued chasing scale instead of foundation. I might have built more, but not stronger. My greatest victory was not standing on the Chicago stage, not seeing Blake in the audience rows. My greatest victory was understanding that I did not need to reclaim anything. I only needed to keep building. And this time, I was not building to surpass someone else. I was building to surpass myself.